We begin not at the surface, not with the polite introductions of ego, but beneath, in the dark soil of what has always been disavowed. Not in what we say, but in what we silence. Not in who we claim to be, but in what we cannot bear to see. The self is rarely born. More often, it is buried, a casualty in the quiet war between desire and survival. And most never notice, because to notice would require undoing everything the mind has built to protect itself. We repress not because we are weak, but because the truth would rupture the fragile architecture of who we think we are. The unconscious is not a storage unit of forgotten things. It is a battlefield, a graveyard of unbearable knowledge. It keeps what would break us hidden, disguised, displaced. You do not simply live your life, you manage it. Against the weight of all that remains unresolved within, against memories unspoken, impulses denied, fantasies shamed into silence. And this war, though invisible, shapes everything. It writes your voice. It chooses your relationships. It governs your guilt. It is why you apologize for things you never did and cannot apologize for the things you did. Neurosis is not madness. It is the logic of a divided mind, one part reaching toward truth, the other recoiling in terror. A compromise formed between the child who feared abandonment and the adult who pretends not to care. And the symptoms? The anxiety, the obsessive thoughts, the numbness, the compulsions, they are not problems to be fixed. They are messages. Obscured? Yes. Symbolic? Yes. But meaningful. Echoes of a mind at war with itself. There are parts of you that know, but knowing is dangerous. Knowing collapses denial. Knowing threatens to bring pain into consciousness. And so the psyche resists, not with force, but with forgetting, with distraction, with rationalization. It offers comfort in exchange for blindness. It sedates with routine. It protects with symptoms. Most people, most of the time, are not seeking freedom. They are seeking safety, and safety demands compromise. So we learn to lie, first to others, then to ourselves. We call it maturity, but often it is surrender. We trade the raw truth of our inner life for roles, for adaptation, for normalcy. And in doing so, we betray something essential. The child never disappears. The wound never heals by itself. The body remembers what the mind cannot. And so we become haunted not by ghosts, but by our own disowned selves. The parts that cried and were shamed. The parts that raged and were punished. The parts that desired and were made to feel dirty. These parts do not go away. They disguise themselves in cynicism, in detachment, in perfectionism, in addiction, in hyper-independence, in the relentless pursuit of approval, in the chronic need to control. What looks like personality is often protection. What looks like confidence may be a fortress built atop humiliation. The unconscious does not forget. It returns in symptoms, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the faces we are drawn to, and the conflicts we cannot stop repeating, in the ache we cannot name, in the self-sabotage we explain away. We are not free simply because we want to be. Freedom requires mourning what we never got, mourning who we had to become, mourning the fact that for many of us, adaptation was a form of betrayal of the self we were meant to be. This is not a journey of self-improvement. It is a confrontation with the father we still fear, with the mother we still protect, with the loneliness that shaped our identity. with the rage that had to be buried, with the desire we were never allowed to feel. You cannot heal what you refuse to see, and you cannot see what the ego was designed to defend against. This is the paradox. The very defenses that protected us from pain now imprison us within it. Repression is not absence, it is presence disguised. Silence is not peace, it is suppression. And survival is not life. To become oneself is to bring into awareness the truths long buried in the unconscious. It is to recover the repressed, to lift it into the light of consciousness and integrate it with the ego, to name the grief, to recognize the lie, to mourn the years lived inside someone else's fantasy of who you should be. This is why most people never become themselves, because the cost is everything they've used to survive. And yet, something in you still remembers, a trace, a fragment, a flicker in the darkness, the moment before the compromise, the scream before it was silenced, the feeling before it was made to feel wrong. That part, the one that never consented, is still there, but it will not reveal itself to your pride, only to your humility, not to your optimism, only to your willingness to grieve, to descend, to give up the fantasy that you were ever whole to begin with. Psychoanalysis does not destroy the self. It seeks to resolve the inner conflicts between the id, ego, and superego. It helps dismantle neurotic symptoms by allowing repressed material to emerge and be worked through. And then it asks you, who are you without it? That silence, that moment, when the defenses fall, is not peace. It is terror, but it is also real. And reality, no matter how painful, is the only place where freedom begins. We do not heal by ascending. We heal by descending into the past, into the body, into the wound. The light does not save us. It simply allows us to see. Most will not choose this, and I do not blame them. The unconscious has its reasons. But for those who feel the ache, the uncanny sense that something essential has been lost, this descent is not optional. It is inevitable. The psyche will call. Symptoms will surface, the dream will return, the body will protest. You suffer because of unresolved conflicts between your drives and internalized prohibitions. The task is not to deny this division, but to make it conscious and to work through it. And everything that feels like failure may be evidence of a self that refuses to die. The war inside is not between good and evil. It is between truth and survival, between the part that wants to remember and the part that must forget to go on. But if you listen not with judgment, but with compassion, the unconscious will speak in symbol, in metaphor, in shame, and in longing. And if you dare to follow, you may not become whole, but you will become honest. And in that honesty, something sacred returns, not perfection, not happiness, but reality. And in the end, reality is the only place the self can live. Underneath every mask, there is not a true face waiting, but another mask. And beneath that, another. Layer after layer of compromise, of distortion, of defenses assembled in the quiet urgency of survival. We call this construction I, as if it were solid, as if it were chosen. But the truth is that most of what we call identity is scaffolding built around pain. The self we perform is often a monument to what we could not bear to feel. To approach this realization is to feel the ground shift beneath you. The ego resists. It tightens its grip. It whispers, "Don't go there. Don't touch that memory. Don't ask that question. Stay here, in the known, in the tolerable, in the fiction that keeps you safe." Yet the symptoms persist. They slip past the watchful ego like coded messages, anxiety that has no clear source, compulsions that defy logic, desires that frighten, dreams that confuse. These are not random malfunctions. They are encrypted truths. The unconscious is cunning. It will not shout what you cannot hear. Instead, it whispers in symbols, in repetitions, in the strange patterns of attraction and avoidance that shape a life. You think you chose your partner. You think you walked away from that job. You think you forgave that parent. But beneath choice, there is compulsion. Beneath forgiveness, there is residue. Beneath the adult narrative, there is a child still waiting to be recognized. And the child waits in silence, because silence was the price of love. As long as you did not speak your anger, you were held. As long as you disowned your need, you were acceptable. As long as you hid your terror, you were safe enough. So you learned to smile, to be good, to adapt. And what you could not suppress, you split off, buried in the body, exiled to the unconscious, disguised as a symptom. To survive, you became two: the self that is seen and the self that must remain hidden. This is repression, not forgetting, but concealing, not erasing, but burying alive. But the buried does not die. It moves underground. It seeps into your relationships, your dreams, your slips of the tongue. It wears the face of a stranger you cannot stop thinking about. It appears in the sudden panic that strikes without warning. It clings to you in the dead of night, in the hollow spaces where the mind can no longer distract itself. And in these moments, the truth approaches. Al-Yimse, a flash of something raw, unmediated. But then the defenses rise again. The intellect explains it away. The body numbs. The mind turns toward distraction. Anything to avoid the unbearable. That what you suffer today was born long ago, in rooms you have not entered for decades, in moments you swore you had left behind. Most never enter those rooms. They fear they will not survive the memories that live there. But the memories are already alive, animating the very neurosis they long to escape. To confront them is not to be consumed, but to understand. To see that the fear you carry was never yours alone, it was given to you. That the shame you feel is not evidence of guilt, but a wound inflicted before you had words. That the rage you suppress is not dangerous, but necessary, the voice of a self that still longs for justice. To descend is to risk everything the ego has built: the narrative of control, the illusion of coherence, the fantasy of innocence. The ego says, "I am good." The unconscious replies, "You are conflicted." The ego says, "I have chosen this life." The unconscious replies, "You have repeated what you could not repair." The ego says, "I know myself." The unconscious replies, "You know only the part of you that was permitted to survive." There is no neat resolution here. To recognize the unconscious is not to heal in the way we imagine. It is not to become whole, but to become truthful. To see yourself not as a singular, sovereign self, but as a system of compromises and contradictions. To realize that what you called strength was often armor, that what you called love was often dependency, that what you called independence was often fear. This recognition does not comfort. It destabilizes. But in destabilization, there is possibility. For the first time, you are not acting out a forgotten story. You are witnessing it. This witnessing is painful because it demands mourning. Mourning the years spent in repression. Mourning the parts of yourself you abandoned to gain approval. Mourning the parent who could not love you as you needed. Mourning the fact that your neurosis, however unbearable, was also a friend, a companion that kept you alive when truth would have been too much. To let go of it is not to celebrate, but to grieve. And so we resist, not because we are foolish, but because we are human. The psyche defends itself for a reason. It is not weak to repress. It is an act of genius in the face of helplessness. But what saved you as a child may imprison you as an adult. The same walls that kept terror out now keep life out. You do not feel joy because you do not feel at all. You do not love fully because to love fully is to risk abandonment. You do not rage because to rage is to remember the powerlessness of your first cries. And so you remain suspended, neither fully alive nor fully dead, a ghost, haunting your own life. The question is not whether you want to heal. The question is whether you can bear to see what was done to you, to see what you did in response, to see how your suffering has become part of your identity, and to see that there is no going back. The child you were will not be restored. The innocence you lost will not return. But perhaps, in seeing, you can step out of the repetition. Perhaps you can choose, for the first time, not from compulsion, but from recognition. This choice is not liberation. It is responsibility. The unconscious does not free you from pain. It demands that you feel it. It does not give you happiness. It gives you reality, and reality is heavy. It requires courage, not to run, not to distract, not to soothe yourself with stories. It requires standing naked before the truth of your own divided mind and saying, yes, this is me. The rage and the love, the shame and the longing, the predator and the victim, the child and the mask, all of it me. Few will take this path. Most will choose to remain at the surface, tending to their symptoms, perfecting their performances, clinging to the ego's fragile assurances. And that, too, is human. The unconscious is patient. It waits. It does not demand recognition, but it leaves traces, in dreams, in slips, in the ache you cannot name, in the moment you look in the mirror and see not a self, but a stranger. This moment is the threshold. To cross it is to die, not physically, but psychically. The old self must dissolve. The defenses must crack. The ego must admit its limits. Only then can something unknown emerge. Not a perfect self. Not a healed self, but a real one. And reality, though it burns, is the only place the soul can breathe. The deeper you descend, the more the ground beneath you dissolves. The truths you believe to be permanent, your convictions, your values, even your memories, begin to feel like constructions, assembled from fragments, distortions, and omissions. You start to see that memory itself is not a faithful witness, but a servant of the ego, reshaping the past to fit the narrative that allows you to live with yourself. It is not what happened that the mind remembers most clearly, but what it needed to believe in order to survive. And beneath this carefully curated story, the unconscious seethes, holding what was too much to hold, speaking in riddles, sabotaging and seducing, forever pulling at the edges of your waking life. You thought desire was simple, that it moved toward pleasure, toward fulfillment. But desire is rarely innocent. It is knotted with guilt, with fear, with unspoken fantasies that violate the ego's ideal of itself. The unconscious does not differentiate between what is moral and what is forbidden. It wants, and in wanting, it exposes the hypocrisy of the ego's righteousness. This is why so much of our longing is disguised, displaced, made safe through substitution. You do not rage at those who hurt you. You rage at those who remind you of them. You do not love freely. You love cautiously, hiding the intensity of your hunger beneath politeness. beneath propriety, beneath the fantasy that love must be pure. But the unconscious knows better. It knows that love is never pure. It is saturated with ambivalence, tenderness entwined with aggression, gratitude laced with resentment, devotion shadowed by envy. And this ambivalence is intolerable to the ego, which craves simplicity, good or bad, right or wrong, victim or perpetrator. Yet the unconscious will not comply. It insists on complexity. It insists on contradiction. And nowhere is this clearer than in sexuality, that most primal expression of life, which so often carries the residue of the earliest bonds. For many, desire is not a liberation but a battleground, haunted by shame, by taboo, by the impossibility of reconciling instinct with the prohibitions that shaped us. The infant's first loves, the mother, the father, leave a psychic imprint that reverberates long after we've forgotten their touch. What begins in the cradle returns in the bed, but disguised, encrypted in attraction and aversion, in fetishes and inhibitions. In the strange way we are drawn to those who wound us and repelled by those who might nourish us. And the guilt, the guilt. It is the silent companion of every unacknowledged desire, whispering that to want is to sin, that to take pleasure is to betray. Guilt does not always appear as guilt. Sometimes it wears the face of anxiety. Sometimes it speaks as an inner critic. Sometimes it hides in depression, pulling you into the gravity of self-reproach without revealing its true origin. This is the superego, the internalized voice of authority, punitive, relentless, demanding penance for desires you did not choose and cannot erase. The superego punishes not only for what you have done, but for what you have imagined, for what you have felt. It does not care that your thoughts harm no one. It demands purity, and finding none, it condemns. But this condemnation is not external. It is your own voice turned against you. The very voice that once kept you safe by aligning you with the expectations of those you depended on now keeps you imprisoned. You cannot rebel without fearing abandonment. You cannot surrender without feeling humiliated. So you oscillate between defiance and submission, never free in either. This is the tragedy of the divided self. You cannot fully renounce the superego, for it carries the memory of love, nor can you fully obey it, for it demands the annihilation of your instinctual life. And so the war continues. On one side, the id, the raw, unfiltered drives that surge from the body, indifferent to rules, to consequences, to the fragile constructions of civilization. On the other, the superego, the tyrant, the censor, the executioner of impulse. And between them, the ego, exhausted, anxious, negotiating compromise after compromise, patching together a semblance of order. But these compromises never hold for long. The repressed returns. The symptom speaks. The dream reveals. The slip exposes. And in these cracks, the unconscious whispers its truth. You are not one. You are many. To approach this truth is to feel yourself unravel. The ego fights back with resistance, 1,000 subtle ways of deflecting what it cannot tolerate. You forget appointments. You yawn in the middle of insight. You intellectualize, analyze, theorize, anything to keep the affect at bay. Resistance is not failure. It is proof that you are approaching the unspeakable. But to go further, you must stop fighting. You must allow what you fear to come closer, even if it feels like madness. Because beneath the fear, there is understanding. Beneath the understanding, there is grief. And beneath the grief, there is life. But what kind of life? Not the tranquil existence promised by self-help doctrines, not the easy happiness sold in the language of affirmation. No, this life is raw, unfiltered, resistant to control. It accepts that joy and sorrow are intertwined, that to love is to risk loss, that to live fully is to confront death. Freud spoke of the death drive, the strange pull toward destruction, repetition, stasis. We see it in our addictions, in our sabotage, in the cycles we cannot escape. It is not a flaw. It is part of the human condition. The wish to return to an earlier state, to dissolve the tension of being, to escape the burden of desire itself. To live is to resist this pull. But to resist it, you must first see it. And seeing is the hardest part. Because to see the death drive is to see how much of your suffering you have chosen, unconsciously, because it is familiar. How many relationships you have entered, not out of love, but out of compulsion. How many times you have destroyed what you longed for, because some buried part of you could not tolerate receiving it. This is not to blame. It is to recognize, to see that the past does not stay in the past. It lives in you, through you, as you. The work of becoming yourself is not glamorous. It is not a linear ascent toward enlightenment. It is a spiral, a repetition, a descent into the same wounds, each time a little deeper, each time with a little more awareness. There is no final victory. No moment when the unconscious is fully known and the self is fully whole. There is only the practice of seeing, of feeling, of staying present to what arises without fleeing. And in this practice, there is a quiet dignity, not the triumphant liberation of the hero, but the humble courage of the one who turns inward and does not turn away. To live like this is to accept that you are both innocent and guilty, strong and fragile, loving and cruel. It is to stop pretending that you are singular. It is to embrace your multiplicity, to make space for all the selves you have been forced to disown. And perhaps, in doing so, you will discover that freedom is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to hold it. That peace is not the silencing of the unconscious, but the willingness to listen. Most will not choose this path. They will remain at the surface, polishing the mask, managing their symptoms, seeking temporary relief. And that is their right. The unconscious cannot be forced open. It waits for readiness. It waits for the moment when the cost of repression exceeds the terror of seeing. For some, this moment never comes. For others, it arrives as a crisis, a collapse, a sudden flood of memory that cannot be contained. And in that flood, there is pain. But there is also the possibility of rebirth. Not the rebirth of fantasy, of becoming a perfect, untouchable self, but the rebirth of honesty, of humility, of the capacity to feel fully, even when it hurts, of the capacity to love, not because you are unscarred, but because you are willing to meet another in their scars. This is the war inside. Not a war that can be won, but a war that can be recognized. And in recognition, there is a strange kind of peace. A peace that says, I am not whole. I am not pure. I am not safe, but I am real. And for the first time, that is enough. The further you go, the more you realize this descent has no bottom. There is no final chamber where the truth lies waiting in perfect clarity. There is only layer after layer of concealment and compromise, each peeled back to reveal another, each defense unraveling to expose the one beneath it. The ego, desperate to preserve its coherence, trembles here. It whispers that you are losing yourself, that to continue is to step into madness. And, in a sense, it is right. For the self, As you have known, it cannot survive this descent. It must fracture, dissolve, make space for what was long exiled. This is not annihilation, though it feels like it. It is recognition. Here, the unconscious begins to speak more clearly, not in the stuttering language of symptoms, not in the oblique code of dreams, but with a voice that feels strangely familiar, like something you always knew but could never quite admit. It says, "You are not one. You are a multitude. And in this multitude, there are voices you have silenced. The angry child who could not protest, the grieving adolescent who could not cry, the desiring body that could not feel. These voices do not ask to dominate. They ask to be heard. They ask to be allowed into the light, no longer forced to act out from the shadows. You begin to see how much of your life has been shaped by what you could not face, how your generosity was often a plea for love, how your independence was a fortress built against the terror of needing, how your strength was the mask you wore over helplessness. You see how the very relationships you sought were chosen to recreate what was familiar, even when that familiarity was wounding. This is transference. The unconscious compulsion to repeat, to stage the original drama again and again in the hope of a different ending. But the ending never changes until the repetition is seen for what it is. To see this is devastating. It shatters the illusion of agency. It shows you how little of your life was chosen freely. But in that shattering, there is an opening. For the first time, you can ask, if not from compulsion, then from where will I live? If not as the child forever seeking approval, then as who? The answer does not come easily. The psyche clings to its patterns. It prefers the known pain to the unknown freedom. Even suffering feels safer than the abyss of unstructured possibility. And then there is the primal fantasy, the unconscious wish that has shaped your entire being, to return to a state before lack, before longing, before separation. This is the fantasy of fusion, of wholeness, of being completely held and needing nothing. It is a fantasy born of the infant's first experience of the world, and it lingers as a silent blueprint for all future desire. Every addiction, every obsessive love, every utopian ideal carries its echo. The wish to undo the wound of existence, to escape the tension of wanting. But to live is to want. To exist is to be divided. And so this fantasy can never be fulfilled. To mourn this is unbearable at first. It is to give up the hope that someone or something will finally make you whole. It is to face the emptiness that all your defenses have sought to cover. But in mourning, there is also liberation. When you stop demanding that life complete you, you are free to meet it as it is. You are free to meet others not as saviors or enemies, but as fellow travelers, fractured, longing, human. Integration means the ego gaining mastery over the id and superego, resolving the contradictions that generate anxiety and restoring a balanced psychic economy. It means allowing the warring parts of your psyche to coexist without suppression or domination. It means recognizing that you will always carry your history, your wounds, your shadows, but that these no longer need to dictate your future. This work is endless. The unconscious does not give up its secrets all at once. It reveals them in waves, in cycles, each insight opening the way for another, each descent followed by another. There is no final arrival, no state of perfect self-knowledge, but with each turn inward, the compulsion to repeat loosens its grip, the symptoms soften, the mask becomes thinner, and in its place, a more fluid, more honest self begins to emerge, not perfect, not invulnerable, but alive. Most will never come here. They will sense the abyss and turn back, choosing distraction over dissent, fantasy over grief, comfort over truth. And who can blame them? The work of knowing oneself is not glamorous. It does not promise happiness. It demands too much and offers no guarantees. But for those who persist, something shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like light seeping into a long sealed room. And in that light you see, you were never whole. You were never pure. You were never in control. But you were always alive. And that is enough. The further you travel inward, the more you realize there is no final door to open, no ultimate revelation to claim as truth. The unconscious is not a puzzle to be solved, but a living force, always moving, always shifting, always resisting the ego's hunger for certainty. And this is perhaps the most difficult truth of all. There is no cure. There is no state of permanent wholeness. The cracks in the psyche are not flaws to be smoothed over. They are the marks of existence itself. To live is to be split. To desire is to suffer. To remember is to ache. And yet, in this very fracture, in this restless tension, something vital stirs. The ego may scream for resolution, for the impossible fantasy of returning to the safety of the womb, to a state before conflict, before longing. But the self that grows here is not the self that is whole. It is the self that knows it will never be whole and lives anyway. This is not an answer. It is a posture, a way of standing in the world with open eyes, refusing to look away from the contradictions that make us human, the tenderness braided with aggression, the love bound up with loss, the joy shadowed by the inevitability of death. The more you see, the more you realize that life does not ask you to transcend these opposites, but to hold them together without flinching. You will never recover the innocence of not knowing. You will never return to the person you were before the descent. The mask will not fit again. And yet, something quieter, truer, emerges from the ruins of what you thought you were. Not a perfect self, but a real one. Not a life without pain, but a life no longer governed by the compulsion to avoid it. This is the war inside, not a war that ends, but a war that teaches you to live with conflict, to make peace with its endlessness. The unconscious will not be conquered. The past will not be erased. The shadow will not disappear. But you can stop running from them. You can stop pretending. You can let go of the fantasy of being saved. And in that surrender, there is a strange kind of freedom. Not the freedom of triumph, but of truth. Not the peace of perfection, but the stillness that comes from no longer resisting what is. You will hurt. You will love. You will rage. You will lose. And one day, you will die. But until then, you can choose to live fully aware of the contradictions, fully awake to the impossible beauty and terror of being human. And in that awareness, you become something you were never allowed to be before. Not perfect, not healed, but finally, impossibly, yourself.